I've been thinking about cultural appropriation. I hear a lot about it on TikTok in particular, but Instagram as well. And I understand, I think the motive for it is people of different traditions want to keep their traditions. They don't want them watered down. And they certainly don't want them used, especially if they're sacred traditions, in a different context. But it sort of runs against human life in many ways. We don't know who invented the wheel, for instance. But somebody figured it out somewhere along the line a long time ago and figured out how to put an axle under it and then some kind of bed and made a little wagon out of it. That's appropriation. I used to work in a medical school for about 4 years as a medical librarian, and those of us in the ancillary staff used to say, doctors learn from doctors who learn from doctors who learn from doctors who learn from doctors who made it up. That's how it works. Yeah. Now, in medicine, of course, appropriation happens all the time. It has to. Now, there are sort of certification processes now. So if a particularly aggressive surgeon tries a new procedure, the limitations on that procedure are eventually regulated, usually governmentally, but not necessarily. Could be self-regulated by medicine itself. But the point is that there are things that are copyrighted and things that are trademarked, but procedures, the movement of them is not usually. So appropriation is the name of how medicine progresses. And a physician has to appropriate because there are standards of care. And standards of care require you to learn whatever the going procedures are and how best to deal with them. And those evolve. That's pretty much how culture in general works. People have their own culture, their own language, and somebody outside the culture sees it, realizes that there's some incredible stuff there, and so they move it to their own cultural experience. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, frankly. It's the only way we can progress is to appropriate. Pretty much everything is an appropriation. Language itself is appropriated. It evolves because it changes and because people use it in different ways. And new words come in and old words get dropped out, and it's just the way of things. Now, if something is sacred, I think it is respectful to treat it as sacred to whatever culture has that. Sacred meaning it connects people to the divine as they understand it. And you can understand why you wouldn't want those holy experiences to be just used willy-nilly by somebody else, particularly for entertainment. Although in many ways, over the last 70 years, or last 120 years, I suppose, religion has become somewhat affected by the performance of theater and entertainment. It just happens. But as I say, if someone identifies something as sacred, something that really carries the ability to transcend reality into supernatural, or whatever you want to call it, not really a good idea to profane that by making it part of somebody else's cultural experience, because it won't necessarily be used in the way that it was meant to be used. But everything else, seems to me, is going to be fair game. It sort of has to be. There's, there are intellectual property rights, and that tends to be a legal matter. I mean, after all, Mickey Mouse is still been more or less protected by copyright for 99 years. At some point, Mickey is going to become part of the public domain, and that's what happens a lot of times. I think one can take pride in the cultural things that have been appropriated, even. Sad to say that black blues and jazz people their ways were appropriated by others, particularly black musicians weren't able to make money at it like later white musicians were. Muddy Waters and the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones appropriated a lot of the folk traditions of the blues, and what can you say about that? They made a lot of money. They occasionally threw some of it back to the people who were the creative force behind it originally. But unfortunately for the creators, they don't necessarily get the credit or the public recognition or the wealth that might come with that, with those amazing creative experiences. I don't know that there's any way to change that. I wish there were. But what I'm saying is that appropriation is inevitable, and unless one can sort of hold up a sacred boundary and invite the general culture not to use that, whatever that is. You know, as the saying goes, I heard a comedian say, Jesus hanging on the cross was not thinking about the fact that the cross itself would then become a little necklace for people to wear. You know, talk about appropriation, and that's appropriation, something that was profoundly profane, being made sacred. It's an inevitable part of the communal aspects of. Now, does that mean we shouldn't recognize when we are taking somebody else's creative process? Well, that would be the thing to do. In academia, the credit is supposed to be given to the original ideas, the creators of the ideas. That's what quotes and footnotes are about. And if one appropriates that and uses it, that is called plagiarism. But it's a very regulated thing in academic life. But in everyday life, there's no similar kind of certification going on. Well, cultural appropriation, it's just a natural process of human association, and I don't think you can stop it. You can invite people to behave themselves. Muslims, for instance, get pretty upset about pictures of the Prophet. That's trying to keep cultural appropriation from happening. It's interesting religiously thinking about it. Christianity and Islam came out of the Hebrew experience, the Jewish experience, and Jews did not even, at least originally, they didn't even say the name of their God. They said Lord instead of the name. The name was sacred, and so they themselves would not say it. And the expectation is nobody else would either. That expectation has changed. Probably not for Jews. But I think the Muslim idea of not allowing pictures of the Prophet, not a bad idea actually, because it's like a black Jesus or a white Jesus. There's local appropriation going on, and in a white group, the sacred is going to be presented from a white perspective, and the black group is going to present it probably from a black percentage. Jesus was a person of color, so that would not have been inappropriate. But, you know, one has to be careful. Anyway, the Muslims, as I say, some of them get downright unsettled and even aggressive and violent about picturing the prophet, because that's part of their tradition. Problem is, it's not part of anybody else's tradition. You know, people like to see as well as hear about. The prophet is certainly sacred and an avenue to the divine, his writings. So that's an important boundary. And for the most part, I think people try to respect that, partly because they don't want to ruffle Muslim sensibilities. At least I hope they don't. Some people don't care and go blast right on through. And damn the torpedoes. But it's just part of being human, is to appropriate. And so you have to sort of figure out how to live with it, or how to push against it, resist it. I think I like the spirit that has brought about the ideas about cultural appropriation. I love the Native people and people of color, Hispanic people, generally minorities in the Western white world, have begun to push against appropriation of their cultural traditions. And that's one way of letting people know what those traditions are and how they are being used and abused. I think that's all to the good. But if you think it's going to stop appropriation, I don't think there's much chance of that. And so, push back. But, you know, what are you going to do? You can go to the extreme and get violent about it, but I don't think that's a helpful boundary when you're dealing with cultural issues. Anyway, some of my thoughts about cultural appropriation. Have a good day.